The massive chamber of the Galactic Council stretched beyond what most species could comprehend, its crystalline walls reaching toward a domed ceiling that displayed the swirling colors of nearby nebulae. Representatives from over 300 civilizations filled the tiered seating, their various forms creating a tapestry of alien diversity that had taken millennia to achieve. At the center of it all stood a single human figure, looking remarkably small and insignificant compared to the towering presence of the Council's most powerful members. Ambassador Sarah Chen maintained her composure despite the hostile energy radiating from every corner of the chamber. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style, and she wore the standard diplomatic uniform of Earth's stellar embassy, a navy blue suit with subtle silver accents that caught the chamber's ambient lighting. To many observers, she appeared unremarkable, even fragile. This perception would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The Speaker of the Council, a being known as Zix Thera, whose species had evolved from predatory hunters on a high-gravity world, towered 12 feet above the chamber floor. Her four arms gestured dramatically as she addressed the assembly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been challenged in 3 centuries of service. The translation devices embedded in every seat rendered her words into the native languages of all present. Fellow members of this ancient and noble council, Zix Thera began, her tone dripping with barely contained disgust. We gather today to address the most egregious violation of galactic law in recorded history. The species known as humanity has committed acts so barbaric, so fundamentally contrary to civilized behavior, that their very presence among us threatens the foundation of everything we have built. A ripple of agreement passed through the chamber. The Veltar delegation, their crystalline forms chiming in harmonic approval, resonated with sounds that spoke of moral superiority. The massive Gorgon representatives, each weighing several tons and resembling walking mountains of muscle and bone, stamped their feet in a rhythm that shook the floor. Even the ethereal quantum collective, beings of pure energy who rarely involved themselves in physical realm politics, flickered with patterns that indicated their support for the speaker's words. Ambassador Chen stood quietly in the defendant's circle, a small platform surrounded by a shimmering energy field that prevented any physical interference. She had been given permission to speak in her own defense, but every species present knew it would be a formality. The evidence against humanity was overwhelming, at least in their eyes. The charges are severe, Zix Thera continued, consulting a holographic display that materialized before her. First, the humans have established what they call military academies on 17 different worlds, institutions dedicated solely to the study and perfection of warfare. Second, they have refused to surrender their weapons manufacturing capabilities despite repeated requests from this council. Third, and most damning of all, they have engaged in what their own records describe as war games, elaborate simulations of combat scenarios that demonstrate their species' obsession with violence and destruction. The chamber erupted in sounds of outrage. The Kellian delegation, peaceful herbivores whose greatest technological achievement was a machine that could synthesize nutrients from starlight, wailed in harmonies that spoke of deep moral offense. The ancient progenitors, who had transcended physical form eons ago and existed as collective consciousness entities, projected waves of disappointment that made several younger species physically uncomfortable. But perhaps most disturbing of all, Zix Thera raised her voice above the chaos, is their response to our reasonable demands for explanation. When asked to justify these activities, their envoy had the audacity to claim that preparation for warfare was necessary for the preservation of peace. Such twisted logic demonstrates a fundamental incompatibility with civilized society. Ambassador Chen finally stepped forward, her movement causing the energy field to shift color from blue to amber. The chamber fell silent, though the silence carried more menace than the previous outrage. She looked around the vast space, her expression calm and measured, as if she were addressing a gathering of colleagues rather than a tribunal that had already decided her species' fate. "Honorable members of the Council," she began, her voice clear and strong despite the vast space, "I stand before you not as a defendant, but as a representative of a species that has learned hard lessons from our own history. You speak of our military academies as if they were houses of horror, but I ask you this. How many of your own species have faced extinction and emerged stronger for it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The truth was that most species in the Council had achieved their current level of civilization through gradual evolution over millions of years, guided by older races and protected by the Council's umbrella of peace. They had never faced the kind of existential threats that had shaped humanity's development. "You condemn our weapons manufacturing," Chen continued, beginning to pace within her confined space. "Yet I notice that each of your species maintains at least some level of defensive capability. The difference is that we are honest about our preparations. We do not hide behind euphemisms or pretend that the universe is always a safe and peaceful place. High Counselor Mordun of the Ethereal Dominion, whose species had evolved beyond physical form but maintained crystalline avatars for interaction with corporeal beings, spoke for the first time. His voice carried the weight of eons, and when he spoke, even the most powerful delegates listened carefully. "Young human," he said, the words somehow conveying both condescension and genuine curiosity. "Your species has existed for what you measure as roughly 200,000 years. Some of us have been conscious for longer than your entire evolutionary timeline. We have seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations, and we know that those who embrace warfare as a solution inevitably destroy themselves. Your preparation for violence demonstrates that you have not yet learned this fundamental truth." Ambassador Chen nodded respectfully before responding. "With respect, High Counselor, I would argue that our preparation for violence is precisely what has allowed us to survive long enough to join this council. Earth has been invaded exactly 17 times since we achieved space travel. Each time, we were prepared. Each time, we not only survived, but emerged stronger and more determined to protect ourselves and our allies." A shocked silence fell over the chamber. The Council's records showed no evidence of any invasions of human space. This was because, as Chen was about to explain, none of the invaders had survived to file reports. "The Skarn Horde thought our system would be an easy target when they arrived 50 years ago," Chen continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. "They were a nomadic species that had consumed the resources of 12 different solar systems before setting their sights on Earth. Their scouts reported that we appeared to be a young, naive species with limited defensive capabilities. They were not entirely wrong. We had only recently developed faster-than-light travel, and our technology was primitive compared to most galactic civilizations." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle on the assembly. The Horde's fleet numbered in the thousands. They had crushed every resistance they had encountered for over 2 centuries. They expected Earth to surrender immediately upon their arrival. The silence in the chamber was now complete. Even the ambient systems seemed to have quieted, creating an atmosphere of suspense that every being present could feel. "The engagement lasted exactly 14 hours, Chen said simply. "When it was over, not a single Horde vessel remained functional. We disabled their ships, captured their crews, and spent the next 3 years helping them establish a peaceful colony on an uninhabited world in the Outer Rim. They now serve as one of our most trusted allies and frequently speak to other species about the importance of choosing diplomacy over aggression." The implications of this statement began to sink in among the council members. If humanity had defeated a force that had conquered 12 solar systems and had done so with primitive technology, what were they capable of now? The Velnash Empire made a similar miscalculation 30 years ago, Chen continued. They believed that our diplomatic overtures were signs of weakness and decided to claim our outer colonies as tribute worlds. Their invasion fleet met our patrol ships at the edge of our territory and demanded immediate surrender. The Velnash delegation, recognizable by their distinctive beetle-like shells and compound eyes, shifted nervously in their seats. They had no official record of this encounter, which meant that their empire had chosen to suppress the information rather than admit to such a significant defeat. That engagement lasted 6 days, Chen said, her gaze moving across the chamber to meet the eyes of as many delegates as possible. The Velnash Empire discovered that our primitive patrol ships were equipped with weapons systems they had never encountered and defensive technologies that made their most advanced attacks completely ineffective. When their Supreme Admiral finally agreed to negotiations, he was shocked to learn that Earth's terms were surprisingly generous. She smiled slightly, though there was nothing warm about the expression. We returned their captured personnel unharmed, provided medical treatment for their wounded, and offered to establish trade relationships that would benefit both civilizations. The Velnash Empire is now one of Earth's closest trading partners, and they frequently recommend our negotiating style to other species who are considering aggressive expansion. High Counselor Zix Thara's 4 arms were now crossed in a gesture that indicated deep displeasure. Even if these accounts are accurate, they only serve to prove our point. Your species has engaged in warfare repeatedly, and you seem proud of these confrontations. A truly civilized species would have found peaceful solutions to these conflicts. Ambassador Chen's expression hardened, and for the first time since entering the chamber, her composure showed signs of strain. A truly civilized species would not have been invaded in the first place. We did not seek these conflicts, High Counselor. They were forced upon us by species who believed that diplomacy was a sign of weakness and that young civilizations existed solely to be conquered or exploited. The chamber erupted again, but this time the sounds were more varied. Some delegates expressed outrage at Chen's implications, while others seemed to be reconsidering their positions. The possibility that humanity had been acting in self-defense changed the moral calculations significantly. Furthermore, Chen continued, raising her voice above the chaos, I find it interesting that this council, which claims to value peace above all else, has never once intervened to prevent any of these invasions. When the Skarn horde was consuming entire civilizations, where was the Council's moral outrage? When the Velnash Empire was claiming tribute worlds through military intimidation, where were your peacekeeping forces? The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This was the silence of beings who had been confronted with an uncomfortable truth. The Galactic Council had indeed turned a blind eye to aggressive expansions by its more powerful members, particularly when those expansions targeted species that were not yet Council members. Speaker Zixathera's voice carried a defensive edge when she responded. The Council cannot be expected to monitor every interaction between species throughout the galaxy. Our resources are limited, and we must focus on maintaining peace among our member civilizations. Exactly, Chen said, her voice now carrying a note of triumph. Your peace exists because you ignore the violence that happens outside your borders. Humanity's preparations for warfare exist because we cannot afford to ignore that same violence. We live in the same universe you do, but we acknowledge its dangers instead of pretending they don't exist. The philosophical implications of this statement began to ripple through the chamber. Many species had joined the Council precisely because it offered protection from the kinds of threats that humanity claimed to face regularly. If these threats were real, and if the Council was indeed ignoring them, then what did that say about the moral foundation of their entire civilization? Ambassador Chen recognized that she had created an opening and pressed her advantage. You ask why we maintain military academies and weapons manufacturing. The answer is simple. We have learned that the best way to preserve peace is to be prepared for war. Our enemies respect our strength and choose negotiation over conflict because they know the cost of aggression will be too high to justify. She gestured toward the assembled delegates. Look around this chamber. How many species here have never faced a serious external threat? How many have achieved their current level of civilization without ever having to fight for survival? You call us warlike, but I would argue that we are simply honest about the realities of existence. The accusation hit home with many delegates. The truth was that most council species had been sheltered by the organization for so long that they had forgotten the struggles their ancestors had faced. They had been able to focus on art, philosophy, and technological advancement precisely because others had handled the messy business of dealing with aggressive neighbors. High Counselor Mordun spoke again, his crystalline avatar flickering with patterns that indicated deep thought. Your arguments have merit, Ambassador Chen, but they do not address our fundamental concern. How can we be certain that a species so prepared for warfare will not eventually turn that preparation against its neighbors? History shows us that civilizations armed for war eventually find reasons to use those arms. Chen nodded, acknowledging the validity of the concern. That is indeed the crucial question, High Counselor, and I believe our record speaks to that point better than any words I could offer. In the 75 years since humanity achieved space travel, we have never initiated hostilities against another species. Every conflict we have engaged in was defensive in nature, and in every case, we offered our opponents more generous terms than they had any right to expect. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before delivering her final point. More importantly, we have used our military capabilities to protect other species as well. The Tauri colonists, who were being threatened by raiders from the broken worlds, found refuge under Earth's protection. The Kethmaran trade routes that were being disrupted by pirates are now secure because human patrol fleets keep them clear. We have turned our weapons against aggression itself, not against peaceful civilizations. The chamber fell silent again as delegates considered this information. Many of them had heard rumors of human intervention in various conflicts, but they had dismissed these stories as exaggerations. The possibility that Earth was actively protecting smaller civilizations without seeking council approval was both admirable and deeply troubling from a political perspective. Speaker Zixthara consulted with her advisors for several minutes before addressing the chamber again. The human envoy has presented information that requires careful consideration. However, the fundamental issue remains unchanged. This council has maintained peace for over 10,000 years through principles of negotiation, compromise, and mutual understanding. The human approach of peace through strength represents a dangerous deviation from these principles. Chen stepped forward again, her expression now showing the strain of the lengthy proceedings. With all due respect, Speaker Zixthara, your peace has been maintained through the luxury of ignoring threats that other species cannot afford to ignore. You speak of negotiation and compromise, but what happens when you encounter a species that views these approaches as weaknesses to be exploited? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The truth was that the Council had rarely encountered truly hostile civilizations, because most aggressive species either destroyed themselves before achieving galactic-level technology or were contained by species like humanity who were willing to use force when necessary. We maintain our weapons and our military academies, Chen continued, not because we love warfare, but because we love peace too much to lose it through naive idealism. Our war games prepare us to defend not only Earth, but any civilization that asks for our protection. Our weapons manufacturing ensures that when we make promises of support, we have the capability to keep them. The philosophical divide between humanity's approach and the Council's traditions was becoming increasingly clear. The Council preferred to maintain peace through isolation and avoidance of conflict, while humanity believed in maintaining peace through the deterrence of potential aggressors. As the session drew to its conclusion, it was clear that no easy resolution was possible. The charges against humanity remained on the official record, but the context provided by Ambassador Chen's testimony had fundamentally changed how many delegates viewed those charges. The final vote would determine not only humanity's fate within the Council, but potentially the future direction of galactic civilization itself. The question was no longer simply whether humanity was too violent to remain in the Council, but whether the Council's approach to peace was sustainable in a universe that contained species willing to use violence to achieve their goals. As the delegates filed out to consider their positions, Ambassador Chen remained standing in the defendant's circle, knowing that whatever decision emerged from this chamber would have consequences that reached far beyond Earth's borders. The emergency session of Earth's Unified Defense Council convened exactly 18 hours after Ambassador Chen's transmission reached home. The circular chamber beneath the Swiss Alps hummed with activity as holographic displays showed real-time data from across human space. Admiral Helena Vasquez stood at the center of the tactical display, her weathered face illuminated by the soft blue glow of stellar charts that depicted humanity's current military disposition. Around the table sat the most powerful individuals in human space. Fleet Admiral Zhang Wei commanded the Third Fleet stationed near Alpha Centauri. General Sarah Mitchell oversaw Earth's planetary defenses. Dr. Elena Rodriguez directed the Office of Xenobiological Intelligence, and Chancellor David Armstrong represented the civilian government. Each person present understood that the decisions made in the next few hours would determine humanity's place in the galaxy for generations to come. "The transmission is clear," Admiral Vasquez began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never lost a battle. "The Galactic Council has voted to condemn our defensive preparations and has given us 30 standard days to dismantle our military academies, surrender our weapons manufacturing capabilities, and submit to Council oversight of all future defense initiatives. Failure to comply will result in our immediate expulsion from the Council and potential military sanctions." The silence that followed was not one of surprise, but of grim determination. Every person in the room had expected this outcome from the moment Ambassador Chen had been summoned to face the Council's tribunal. The Council's fear of humanity's military capabilities had been growing for years, and Chen's honest testimony about Earth's defensive history had apparently confirmed their worst suspicions. Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward, her cybernetic implants glowing softly as she accessed classified intelligence files. "Our xenobiology teams have been monitoring Council communications since the trial began. The vote was closer than they're publicly admitting. 147 in favor of sanctions, 96 opposed, and 57 abstentions. More importantly, the opposition included some very powerful species who are growing increasingly uncomfortable with the Council's policies." Chancellor Armstrong, his diplomatic training evident in his measured tone, raised the question that everyone was thinking. "What exactly are our options here? We can't simply ignore the Council's ultimatum, but we also can't afford to leave ourselves defenseless in a galaxy that has repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to prey on the weak." Fleet Admiral Zhang Wei, his scarred hands folded on the table before him, spoke with the bluntness that had made him famous throughout the fleet. "Our options are simple, Chancellor. We can comply with the Council's demands and hope they protect us when the next invasion comes. Or we can refuse and deal with whatever consequences they choose to impose." General Mitchell activated a holographic display showing Earth's current defensive posture. "If we comply with their demands, we'll be vulnerable within 6 months. Our military academies train more than just officers. There are primary research facilities for defensive technology. Our weapons manufacturing doesn't just produce arms for Earth. We supply defensive systems to 17 different species who can't protect themselves. Dismantling these capabilities would leave a massive power vacuum that hostile forces would be quick to exploit. The tactical implications were sobering. Humanity had become the unofficial protector of dozens of smaller civilizations, not through conquest or coercion, but because they were the only species willing and able to stand against aggressive expansion by hostile powers. Without Earth's protection, many of these civilizations would face immediate threats from predatory neighbors. Admiral Vasquez brought up a classified file that caused several security alerts to flash across the room's displays. Intelligence suggests that at least 3 major hostile forces have been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. The Void Hunters have been probing our outer colonies for months, testing our response times and defensive capabilities. The Crimson Horde has been massing ships near the neutral zone, and our deep space monitors have detected unusual activity in Dark Fleet territory. The Dark Fleet was humanity's designation for a mysterious force that had been observed in the galaxy's outer rim territories. Their technology was advanced beyond anything the Council possessed, and their few recorded interactions with other species had been uniformly hostile. Most Council species preferred to pretend the Dark Fleet didn't exist, rather than confront the implications of their presence. Dr. Rodriguez's analysis painted an even grimmer picture. Our psychological profiles of the major Council species show that most of them have become dependent on the illusion of absolute security. They genuinely believe that diplomatic solutions can resolve any conflict because they've never encountered a truly hostile force that wasn't eventually stopped by someone else. If we're removed from the equation, they're going to face a very harsh awakening. Chancellor Armstrong understood the political ramifications better than anyone. So we're facing a choice between abandoning our defensive capabilities and potentially sacrificing the lives of billions of beings throughout the galaxy, or defying the Council and facing whatever military response they can muster. It's not much of a choice, General Mitchell observed grimly. The Council's military capabilities are limited to peacekeeping operations against technologically inferior opponents. Most of their member species haven't fought a real war in centuries. If they try to force compliance through military action, they'll be sending their forces against opponents who have been preparing for exactly this scenario since we first encountered hostile aliens. Admiral Vasquez activated another display showing the current disposition of Earth's fleets. We have 137 fully operational warships stationed throughout human space, with another 43 under construction in our shipyards. More importantly, our allies have been quietly upgrading their own defensive capabilities using human technology. The Tauri Federation now fields 26 heavy cruisers. The Keth-Moran Trade Union has 41 escort vessels, and even the peaceful Jelnari have finally agreed to arm their merchant ships. The implications were staggering. Without realizing it, the Council had allowed humanity to create an informal alliance network that could potentially match their own military capabilities. The irony was that this network existed purely for defensive purposes, but the Council's actions were forcing it to consider offensive operations for the first time. Dr. Rodriguez highlighted another crucial factor. Our intelligence networks have identified 17 Council species who are secretly sympathetic to our position. They're afraid to speak openly against the Council's leadership, but they've been quietly sharing information with our diplomatic corps. If we're forced into opposition with the Council, we won't be facing a unified enemy. Fleet Admiral Zhang Wei had been reviewing tactical assessments during the discussion, and his conclusions were sobering. The mathematical reality is that we can't win a direct confrontation with the entire Galactic Council. However, we don't need to win. We need to make the cost of victory so high that they choose negotiation instead. Our defensive capabilities are specifically designed to inflict maximum casualties on attacking forces while minimizing our own losses. The strategy he was describing was essentially a galactic version of deterrent doctrine. Earth's military philosophy had always focused on making aggression so costly that potential enemies chose peaceful alternatives. The question now was whether this approach would work against a council that had convinced itself of its own moral superiority. Chancellor Armstrong brought up the civilian perspective that military leaders sometimes overlooked. We need to consider the humanitarian implications of whatever action we take. If we defy the Council and trigger a galactic conflict, billions of innocent beings will suffer the consequences. If we comply and leave ourselves defenseless, billions of other beings will suffer when hostile forces fill the power vacuum we leave behind. The moral calculus was impossibly complex. Every option involved significant risks to civilian populations, and there was no clear path that would minimize suffering across the galaxy. This was exactly the kind of scenario that had driven humanity to develop its military capabilities in the first place. Situations where peaceful idealism simply wasn't sufficient to protect innocent lives. General Mitchell proposed a third option that had been under discussion in military circles for months. What if we withdraw from Council space entirely? We could relocate our critical infrastructure to systems outside Council jurisdiction and continue protecting our allies from independent territories. Let the Council maintain their illusion of peace in their own space while we deal with the reality of galactic politics elsewhere. The proposal had merit, but it also carried significant risks. Abandoning Council space would mean giving up decades of diplomatic relationships and economic partnerships. It would also send a message to hostile forces that humanity was willing to retreat when pressured, which could encourage further aggressive actions. Dr. Rodriguez had been analyzing the long-term implications of various responses, and her conclusions were disturbing. Our models suggest that compliance with the Council's demands would result in a 73% probability of major galactic conflict within 5 years. The hostile forces that we've been keeping in check won't remain patient indefinitely, and the Council's military capabilities are insufficient to contain them without our assistance. Admiral Vasquez had reached her own conclusion about the situation. The Council has put us in an impossible position, but they've also made a critical error in their calculations. They assume that we need them more than they need us. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Our defensive network has been preventing conflicts that would destabilize the entire galactic economy. If we're forced to withdraw that protection, the consequences will reach every system in Council space. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Humanity had not sought to become the galaxy's protector, but circumstances had forced them into that role. Now the Council was demanding that they abandon it without providing any alternative means of maintaining stability. Fleet Admiral Jiang Wei finally voiced what everyone was thinking. We can't comply with their demands without abandoning our responsibilities to our allies and leaving the galaxy vulnerable to forces that the Council can't or won't acknowledge. But we also can't ignore the fact that defying the Council will have serious consequences for our own people. Chancellor Armstrong made the decision that would define humanity's future relationship with the galactic community. We give them exactly what they've asked for, but we do it in a way that demonstrates the consequences of their demands. If they want us to abandon our military capabilities, we'll show them what the galaxy looks like without Earth's protection. The plan that emerged from the emergency session was both elegant and terrifying in its implications. Earth would formally comply with the Council's demands by beginning the dismantling of their military academies and weapons manufacturing facilities. However, they would also initiate a complete withdrawal of all protective services from non-human territories. Every alliance, every trade route patrol, every defensive pact would be terminated simultaneously. Admiral Vasquez began issuing orders that would reshape the galactic balance of power. Recall all fleets to human space immediately. Terminate all security agreements with non-Council species. Suspend all defensive technology transfers, including spare parts and maintenance support. and send a formal notification to every civilization under our protection that Earth's defense umbrella will be withdrawn in 30 days. The message to the Galactic Council would be clear and impossible to ignore. If they wanted humanity to abandon its defensive preparations, they would discover exactly what threats those preparations had been designed to address. The Council would get their wish for a galaxy without human military influence, but they would also inherit responsibility for all the problems that humanity had been quietly solving. Dr. Rodriguez calculated the likely timeline for the consequences to become apparent. Based on historical patterns, we should expect the first major incidents within 72 hours of our withdrawal. The Void Hunters have been planning an assault on the Outer Rim colonies for months, and they'll move immediately once they realize our patrols have been withdrawn. The Crimson Horde will likely follow within a week. General Mitchell was already preparing Earth's defenses for the chaos that would follow. We need to be ready for the possibility that the Council will demand our intervention once the situation deteriorates. They'll want us to clean up the mess without acknowledging that their policies created it in the first place. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. The Council had condemned humanity for being too prepared for warfare, and now they were about to discover what the galaxy looked like when no one was prepared for it at all. As the emergency session concluded, each participant understood that they were witnessing a turning point in galactic history. The age of Council-imposed peace was ending, and what would replace it remained to be seen. Humanity had tried to work within the system, but the system had ultimately rejected them for the very qualities that made them effective guardians of galactic stability. The next 30 days would determine whether the Galactic Council could maintain order without Earth's assistance, or whether they would be forced to acknowledge that their idealistic approach to galactic politics was fundamentally incompatible with the realities of a universe that contained predatory civilizations willing to use violence to achieve their goals. The emergency broadcasts began exactly 79 hours after Earth's withdrawal from galactic protection duties. High Counselor Zix Thara stood before the assembled Galactic Council, her forearms trembling with barely contained fury as she read from a datapad that seemed to grow heavier with each new report. The massive chamber that had recently echoed with moral outrage about humanity's military preparations now resonated with panic and confusion as the consequences of their demands became horrifyingly clear. The Void Hunter fleet has destroyed 17 colonial settlements in the Outer Rim sectors, Zix Thara announced, her voice carrying none of its usual authority. The Crimson Horde has seized control of the main trade routes between the core worlds and the expansion territories. 3 species have formally requested emergency military intervention, and another 7 have reported raiding activities in their border systems. The chamber erupted into chaos as delegates from affected systems began shouting demands for immediate action. The crystalline Veltar, whose harmonic voices had recently sung of humanity's warmongering tendencies, now produced discordant notes of pure terror as their merchant fleets faced destruction at the hands of raiders who had previously been kept in check by human patrols. Representative Kethmore of the Tauri Federation stood at his delegation's platform, his normally calm demeanor replaced by visible desperation. Where are the Council's peacekeeping forces? Our colonies are being slaughtered while we debate protocol. The human fleets that protected us for decades withdrew exactly as you demanded, and now we face extinction. High Counselor Mordun's crystalline avatar flickered with patterns that indicated extreme distress. The ancient being had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, but the speed with which galactic stability had collapsed following Earth's withdrawal was unprecedented in his vast experience. The Council's peacekeeping vessels are mobilizing as quickly as possible, he announced, though his tone carried little confidence. However, our forces were designed for enforcement actions against minor disputes, not military campaigns against organized hostile fleets. We are contacting our military advisors to assess our options. The admission sent another wave of panic through the chamber. The Council's military forces consisted primarily of lightly armed vessels designed to intimidate non-Council species into compliance. They had never been intended to face the kind of hardened combat fleets that humanity had been quietly fighting for decades. Ambassador Chen, who had remained on Council station following her testimony, watched the proceedings from the observer's gallery. Her face showed no satisfaction at the chaos unfolding below, only the grim resignation of someone who had tried to prevent exactly this scenario. She had warned the Council that Earth's military preparations served a vital function, but they had chosen to see only the weapons rather than the threats those weapons held at bay. The situation reports continued to pour in with devastating regularity. The peaceful Gelnari, whose philosophy of absolute nonviolence had made them beloved throughout Council space, sent desperate pleas for assistance as their worlds faced bombardment from species that viewed pacifism as an invitation to conquest. The sophisticated Kellian civilization, which had devoted centuries to the perfection of artistic expression, discovered that their aesthetic achievements provided no defense against raiders seeking slaves and resources. Fleet Admiral Torvash of the Council Defense Force stood to address the assembly, his massive frame impressive even among the diverse species present. His people, the Gorgon, were among the few Council races with recent military experience, but even they had not faced the kind of coordinated assaults that were now devastating the outer territories. Our preliminary analysis indicates that these attacks were planned well in advance, he reported, his rumbling voice carrying throughout the chamber. The Void Hunters and Crimson Horde had been preparing coordinated strikes against multiple targets, but they were being held in check by human patrol fleets. The moment those patrols withdrew, they implemented their assault plans immediately. The implications were staggering. The hostile forces had been watching and waiting, building their strength while humanity's defensive networks kept them contained. Earth's withdrawal had not created the threat. It had simply revealed how serious that threat had always been. Speaker Zixthara struggled to maintain order as more reports arrived. The Kethmoran Trade Union reports that 60% of their merchant vessels have been captured or destroyed. The hegemony of United Worlds has lost contact with 4 entire star systems. The Independent Colonial Alliance has formally declared a state of emergency and is requesting immediate military assistance. Dr. Selhan of the Quantum Collective, whose species rarely involved itself in physical realm politics, manifested a more solid form than usual to address the crisis. The mathematical models are clear, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of a species that thought in terms of probability fields rather than linear time. Without intervention by a military force capable of engaging these hostile fleets on equal terms, we will lose approximately 30% of our outer territories within 40 standard days. The calculation sent another shockwave through the chamber. 30% of the Council's territory represented billions of lives and centuries of civilization development. The cost of ignoring the threats that humanity had been addressing was becoming impossible to deny. Chancellor Yith-Ara of the Celestial Dominion, whose species had joined the Council only recently, stood to voice what many delegates were thinking. Perhaps it is time to reconsider our demands regarding human military capabilities. If their forces were preventing this catastrophe, then clearly their preparation served a legitimate defensive purpose. The suggestion was met with heated opposition from the Council's most traditional members. High Counselor Velthar, whose crystal form resonated with indignation, responded immediately. We cannot allow fear to drive us into abandoning our principles. If we legitimize human militarism in response to this crisis, we risk undermining the very foundations of our peaceful civilization. Ambassador Chen finally requested permission to address the Council, and after a heated debate, Speaker Zixthara granted her the floor. Chen walked slowly to the defendant's platform, the same space where she had been condemned just days earlier for representing a species that prepared for warfare. "Honorable members of the Council," she began, her voice carrying easily through the vast chamber. "I take no pleasure in the current crisis. Earth's forces were withdrawn not out of spite, but out of compliance with your explicit demands. You required us to abandon our military capabilities, and we have done exactly as instructed." The chamber fell silent as her words sank in. Chen continued, "However, I must point out that the current situation validates everything we tried to explain during our trial. The galaxy contains hostile forces that cannot be reasoned with, negotiated with, or appeased. They respect only strength, and they prey upon weakness wherever they find it." She gestured toward the tactical displays showing the expanding zones of conflict. "Every settlement being destroyed, every trade route being seized, every colony ship being captured. These are the consequences of a galaxy without adequate defensive preparations. We tried to shoulder this burden quietly, without demanding recognition or thanks, because we understood the necessity of maintaining stability." High Counselor Mordoon's avatar flickered with patterns of acknowledgement. "Your point is taken, Ambassador Chen. However, the immediate question is, what can be done to address the current crisis? Will Earth consider resuming its protective activities while we develop alternative solutions?" Chen's response was carefully measured. "Earth remains committed to defending our own territories and our formal allies. However, the Council made it clear that our military activities were unwelcome in Council space. We cannot resume operations that you have officially condemned without some indication that your position has changed." The diplomatic implications were clear. If the Council wanted Earth's assistance, they would need to formally acknowledge that their previous demands had been based on incomplete understanding of the galactic security situation. This would require admitting that their idealistic approach to galactic politics had failed when confronted with real threats. Speaker Zixthara consulted with her advisors before responding. What would Earth require in order to resume defensive operations in the affected areas? Full restoration of our military academies and weapons manufacturing capabilities, Chen replied immediately. Formal recognition that defensive preparations are not only legitimate, but necessary for maintaining galactic stability, and a commitment that the Council will not again demand the abandonment of capabilities that are essential for protecting innocent civilizations. The terms were harsh, but fair. Earth was not seeking special privileges or exemptions from Council oversight. They were demanding the right to maintain the capabilities that had prevented the current crisis from occurring much earlier. The debate that followed revealed deep divisions within the Council that had been hidden beneath the surface of their previous unity. Many species that had previously supported the condemnation of human militarism were now reconsidering their positions as reports of destruction continued to arrive from the outer territories. Representative Morhan of the Ethereal Collective spoke for many when she admitted, "We have been naive in our assumptions about the nature of galactic politics. The humans were providing a service that we failed to appreciate because we never witnessed the threats they were addressing." However, the traditional faction within the Council remained opposed to any formal acknowledgement that their policies had failed. High Counselor Velthar maintained, "Legitimizing military solutions to political problems will only encourage more violence in the long term. We must find alternative approaches that do not depend on weapons and warfare." The philosophical divide that had driven the original conflict remained unresolved, even as the practical consequences of that divide devastated the outer territories. The Council was trapped between their idealistic principles and the harsh realities of galactic politics. Dr. Rodriguez of Earth's Xenobiological Intelligence Division transmitted an analysis that crystallized the situation. Based on current patterns, the hostile forces will have consolidated control over the major trade routes within 2 weeks. At that point, they will be in a position to demand tribute from core world systems and potentially threaten the Council homeworlds themselves. The prospect of the core worlds facing direct threats finally broke through the ideological deadlock. Even the most pacifistic species could understand that their philosophical principles would be meaningless if their civilizations were destroyed or enslaved. Emergency session followed emergency session as the Council struggled to develop a response. Traditional peacekeeping approaches proved utterly inadequate against opponents who had no interest in peaceful resolution. Diplomatic overtures were met with demands for unconditional surrender. Economic sanctions were meaningless against forces that preferred to take what they wanted by force. By the end of the first week, the scope of the crisis had expanded beyond anyone's worst fears. The Void Hunters had begun systematically destroying colonial infrastructure rather than simply occupying territory, apparently for the simple pleasure of causing maximum suffering. The Crimson Horde was implementing forced relocation programs that separated families and destroyed cultural continuity. New hostile forces, emboldened by the apparent collapse of galactic security, began emerging from regions that had been quiet for centuries. The breaking point came when the Dark Fleet, the mysterious force that had haunted the galaxy's outer rim, launched its first major assault against Council territories. Their technology proved to be significantly more advanced than anything the Council possessed, and their intentions appeared to be nothing less than the complete subjugation of all galactic civilizations. As the Council Defense Force suffered devastating defeats against opponents they could neither understand nor effectively engage, even the most traditional delegates began to acknowledge that their previous approach had been fundamentally flawed. The galaxy was not a peaceful place that occasionally experienced minor disputes. It was a dangerous environment where only the strong could survive, let alone protect the weak. Speaker Zixathara made the announcement that would reshape galactic politics. In light of the current emergency, the Galactic Council formally requests the assistance of Earth's military forces in restoring stability to the affected regions. Furthermore, we hereby acknowledge that defensive preparations are not only legitimate, but essential for maintaining the security upon which our civilization depends. Ambassador Chen accepted the request on behalf of Earth, but her conditions were clear. Humanity would help address the immediate crisis, but the fundamental relationship between Earth and the Council would need to be renegotiated. The age of naive idealism was over, and what would replace it remained to be determined. The irony was complete. The Council had condemned Earth for being too prepared for warfare, only to discover that their survival depended on exactly that preparation.